A paralyzed baby had no chance until a miracle cat defied all odds and transformed his life. In the cold silence of the hospital corridor, Emily's world shattered as the doctor delivered the unthinkable. Her baby, Dylan, would never move again, but an unexpected companion was about to bring a spark of hope they never saw coming. Emily stood frozen in the dimly lit hospital corridor, the cold white tiles under her feet feeling like ice. The sound of her husband Marcus's unsteady breathing beside her only heightened the suffocating silence. She clutched her 6-month-old son Dylan against her chest as if holding him tighter might undo the words she just heard.
"I'm so sorry, Mrs. Harper."
The neurologist had said, her voice soft but unrelenting.
"Dylan's condition is called spinal muscular atrophy. It's rare, and in his case, severe. The paralysis has already set in, and it's irreversible."
The world tilted. Emily swayed, her knees threatening to give way. Marcus steadied her, his strong arms trembling against her weight. She looked down at Dylan, his little face peaceful, oblivious to the cruel truth being spoken about his tiny body. A single tear slid down her cheek, landing on Dylan's blanket.
He won't be able to move at all."
Emily managed to whisper, her voice breaking under the weight of her despair. The doctor hesitated, her eyes full of sympathy.
"He's paralyzed from the neck down. His muscles won't develop and he won't regain mobility. I wish I had better news."
The words carved themselves into Emily's soul, leaving an ache so deep she wondered if it would ever go away. The drive home was a blur of silence, interrupted only by Dylan's soft coos from his car seat. Emily stared out of the window, her mind spiraling back to when everything had been normal. She thought about the first time she had held Dylan in her arms, how his tiny fingers had wrapped around hers with surprising strength. She remembered his first smiles, his laughter. Oh, how he used to laugh at the silliest things, like the jingling keys Marcus would dangle above him. Those moments felt like a lifetime ago, stolen away in a matter of weeks. It had started so subtly. At first, Dylan's hands seemed weaker than they should have been, his legs floppy. They had thought it was just a phase that he would grow out of it. But then he stopped kicking during diaper changes, stopped moving his arms during playtime. When he could no longer lift his head, they had rushed him to the pediatrician, their hearts already heavy with unspoken fears. Now those fears had a name, one that felt like a death sentence for the future they had dreamed of for their son. At home, the days blurred together in a haze of tears and exhaustion. Therapy sessions became their new routine, but they often felt like going through the motions. Emily sat beside Dylan during each session, her heart breaking as his tiny body refused to respond to the therapist's gentle manipulations. She would force herself to smile, to murmur encouragement, but at night, when Dylan was finally asleep, she would crumble into Marcus's arms, sobbing until she was too exhausted to feel anything at all. The financial strain only added to the weight. The mounting medical bills loomed over them like a dark cloud, threatening to crush the little hope they clung to. Marcus took on extra hours at work, but even that wasn't enough to cover everything. They sold their second car, cut back on groceries, and yet it always felt like they were barely keeping their heads above water. Their marriage began to show cracks. The late-night arguments about money, the unspoken blame for missed signs, the exhaustion that left them both with nothing to give each other. And yet, through it all, they found a way to hold on. Dylan was their glue, their reason to fight through the pain. Amid the chaos, there was Whisker. The family's tabby cat had been a fixture in their home long before Dylan was born. Once playful, Whisker had mellowed over the years, content to spend his days lounging in sunlit spots around the house or curling up on the windowsill to watch birds. To Emily, Whisker was just another part of the background noise of their lives. He offered no comfort, no solutions, no miracles. While she loved the cat, she often found herself too preoccupied to notice him. In the whirlwind of therapy schedules, doctor's visits, and sleepless nights, Whisker seemed almost irrelevant. Occasionally, he would wander into Dylan's nursery, leaping onto the windowsill or curling up in the corner of the crib while Dylan slept. Emily would shoo him out gently, afraid he might disturb the baby. But Whisker always returned, as if drawn to Dylan by some invisible force.
"Why does he even bother?"
Emily muttered one day, catching sight of Whisker perched outside Dylan's crib. She didn't know if she was angry or just too tired to care. It was a passing thought, one she wouldn't remember until much later, when everything began to change. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind of stillness that felt heavy in the Harper household. Emily sat slumped on the living room couch, staring blankly at a stack of unpaid medical bills on the coffee table. The silence was broken only by the faint hum of the baby monitor and the occasional creak of the old house. Dylan had been particularly fussy earlier, but he had finally drifted off to sleep in his crib. Emily rubbed her temples, exhaustion pulling at her every muscle. She hadn't had a proper night's sleep in weeks, and the weight of their struggles was becoming unbearable. The guilt was the worst part. No matter how many times Marcus reassured her, she couldn't shake the feeling that somehow she had failed Dylan. She stood up, deciding to check on him. The nursery door was slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, her heart stopped. There in the soft glow of the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window was Whisker. The cat was curled up on Dylan's tiny chest, his fluffy gray body rising and falling with the baby's shallow breasts.
No!
Emily gasped, rushing forward. She feared the worst, that Whisker's weight might hurt Dylan, or worse, restrict his already fragile breathing. She reached out to shoo the cat away, but then she froze. Dylan giggled. The sound was so sudden, so unexpected, that Emily almost didn't recognize it. Her son's sweet, musical laugh, a sound she hadn't heard in weeks, broke through the oppressive silence that had surrounded them for so long.
Dylan?
She whispered, her voice trembling. And then she saw it. His tiny fingers, so limp and unmoving for months, twitched. Just the smallest movement, barely perceptible, but it was there. Emily's hands flew to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She could only watch as her baby, her sweet, paralyzed baby, moved for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Whisker remained where he was, purring softly, his eyes half closed in contentment. Dylan's eyes, bright and curious, seemed to follow the sound of the purring, his lips curling into the faintest of smiles. Emily sank to her knees beside the crib, her tears falling freely now. She reached out to touch Dylan's tiny hand, and though it didn't grip her the way it used to, there was a warmth there, a life she hadn't felt in so long.
Oh, my baby.
She whispered, her voice breaking. She looked at Whisker, who opened his eyes lazily, almost as if to say, "What did you expect?" Emily didn't know what to think. Was this a fluke? A coincidence? Or could the cat, this lazy, aloof tabby who spent most of his time napping, have something to do with it? The thought seemed absurd, but the proof was right in front of her. Over the next few days, Whisker's behavior became impossible to ignore. The cat, who had always been indifferent to Dylan, now refused to leave his side. Whenever Emily placed Dylan in his crib, Whisker would jump in after him, carefully curling up next to him without disturbing him. During Dylan's naps, Whisker's deep, rhythmic purring filled the room like a soothing melody. At first, Emily had been hesitant, afraid the cat might hurt Dylan, but she quickly realized that Whisker was gentle, almost unnaturally so. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if he knew how fragile Dylan was. What was even stranger was Dylan's response. He seemed calmer when Whisker was near. The usual whimpers and cries that punctuated his days grew less frequent. His eyes followed the cat's every move, and his lips would sometimes twitch into a faint smile when Whisker nuzzled him. Emily began noticing subtle changes in Dylan's behavior. He started making small, deliberate movements, wiggling his fingers more often, turning his head slightly toward Whisker's purring. They were tiny improvements, but to Emily they felt monumental. One evening, as she sat in the nursery watching Dylan sleep with Whisker curled protectively beside him, Marcus came in. Emily stood by the crib, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her son Dylan's chest. Her gaze shifted to the cat nestled beside him, a slender tabby with a coat of soft, gray fur that caught the light just so. Whisker had been there for hours, his small body curled protectively against Dylan's side, emitting a soft, steady purr. The sound filled the room, a soothing hum that seemed to wrap itself around everything, softening even the sharp edges of Emily's worries. This had been happening all week. Every time Dylan stirred, whimpered, or even let out a weak cry, Whisker would appear. No coaxing, no hesitation, just an unwavering presence, as though the cat had taken on a sacred duty. Emily's heart ached as she studied her son. Dylan's condition had cast a shadow over their lives, a fog of uncertainty that neither she nor Marcus could escape. The doctors spoke in cautious tones, offering little hope, and the steady hum of medical equipment in their home had become the soundtrack of their days. Yet something was different now, something she couldn't quite explain. Dylan, who had spent weeks in a haze of inactivity, seemed more alive. His small hands, once limp and unmoving, had begun to twitch, the faintest flicker of motion. His eyes, often dull and unfocused, now tracked the light as it danced across the room. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Emily noticed. She always noticed. And then there was Whisker. He wasn't an especially remarkable cat, lazy, aloof, and prone to napping in the oddest places. Yet now he was a constant fixture by Dylan's side. It wasn't just his presence that struck Emily. It was the way he interacted with her son. The gentle nuzzles, the way his purring seemed to deepen whenever Dylan stirred, and the serene patience with which he stayed, unmoving, for hours on end. It was as if he understood, truly understood, what Dylan needed. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary was happening. It wasn't just her maternal hope clinging to straws. It was something tangible. Dylan's restlessness, once a nightly torment, had subsided. The bouts of inconsolable crying that left her feeling helpless had nearly disappeared. And those tiny movements, those miraculous, fragile movements, seemed to coincide with Whisker's presence. Marcus had noticed too, though he was less inclined to voice it. He would linger by the crib longer than usual, his eyes narrowing as he watched the cat and their son. There was skepticism in his posture, but also a quiet curiosity, as though he couldn't quite dismiss what was unfolding before him. The days passed, and the bond between Whisker and Dylan grew deeper. Emily found herself marveling at the cat's intuition. It was as if Whisker had been waiting for this moment, for this purpose, all along. His behavior became almost ritualistic, leaping onto the crib whenever Dylan showed signs of distress, curling into a tight ball against him, and purring with an intensity that seemed to fill the entire house. Emily began to trust Whisker in ways she never thought possible. There was a peace in the room whenever he was there, a sense that, no matter how uncertain the future, they weren't entirely powerless. She started documenting the small victories. Dylan's fingers curling around a blanket, his eyes following her as she moved across the room, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to give her hope, enough to make her believe that perhaps miracles could come in the most unexpected forms. Whisker wasn't just a cat anymore. He was a lifeline, a beacon in the dark, and a quiet reminder that even in the most difficult times, connections, no matter how unlikely, could bring light where there was once only shadow. As she sat by the crib, stroking Dylan's delicate hand, Emily let her gaze fall on Whisker once more. The cat's eyes were half closed, his purring steady and unwavering. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, the weight on her chest lifting just slightly. In that small, quiet room, surrounded by love and uncertainty, Emily felt a fragile but undeniable truth take root in her heart. Healing could come in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes it wore a soft coat of gray fur and purred like a heartbeat. She reached out to stroke the cat's soft fur.
Thank you.
She whispered, her voice breaking. Whisker looked at her with his calm, knowing eyes before resuming his purring. For the first time in months, Emily allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Emily couldn't stop thinking about what she'd seen. Ever since that first moment Dylan giggled and moved his fingers with Whisker on his chest, she found herself watching the cat more closely. There was something about the way Whisker acted around Dylan now. It was deliberate, almost purposeful. One morning, as Emily placed Dylan on his playmat in the living room, Whisker padded over and sat beside him. At first, the cat just observed, his tail flicking lazily. Then slowly, Whisker nudged Dylan's tiny hand with his nose. It was gentle, like a suggestion rather than a demand. Dylan's fingers twitched in response. Emily leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat.
Come on, baby.
She whispered.
You can do it.
Whisker nudged again, this time with his paw. His claws retracted as if he understood how fragile Dylan was. Emily watched in awe as Dylan's fingers wiggled again, just a little more this time. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next few days brought more surprises. Whisker began nudging not just Dylan's hands, but his feet as well. He'd bat at Dylan's tiny toes, retreating just far enough to wait for a response before trying again. Dylan's movements were small and uncoordinated, but they were there. Emily couldn't help but wonder if this was more than a coincidence. Whisker wasn't just lying beside Dylan anymore. He was engaging with him, almost as if he knew Dylan needed encouragement. One afternoon, Marcus walked into the room and found Emily on the floor beside Dylan and Whisker, tears streaming down her face.
What's wrong?
He asked, panic flashing in his eyes. Emily shook her head, laughing through her tears.
Nothing. Look.
Marcus knelt down, watching as Whisker tapped Dylan's foot with his paw. A moment later, Dylan's toes wiggled in response. Marcus's jaw dropped.
He moved.
Marcus whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Emily nodded, her smile radiant.
He's been doing it all morning.
Marcus reached for Emily's hand, squeezing it tightly. For the first time in months, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. When the day came for Dylan's next therapy session, Emily had an idea. She scooped Whisker into her arms as she gathered Dylan's things.
You're bringing the cat?
Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. Emily nodded.
I know it sounds crazy, but I think Whisker might be helping him. I want to see if it makes a difference during therapy.
At the clinic, the therapist, a kind woman named Sarah, gave Whisker a curious glance but didn't object. As Dylan lay on the padded mat, Sarah gently guided his arms and legs through their usual exercises. Normally, Dylan would fuss or cry, his body stiff and resistant to the movements. But today, with Whisker lying beside him, purring steadily, Dylan was calm. Sarah looked at Emily, her eyebrows raised.
He's so much more relaxed today. Whatever you're doing, keep it up.
Emily smiled, her heart swelling with a deep and tender warmth as she watched the scene unfold before her. Whisker, with his soft gray fur glinting faintly in the light of the room, nuzzled Dylan's tiny hand with deliberate care. The cat's purring grew louder, a rich, soothing sound that seemed to fill every corner of the nursery. Dylan's fingers twitched in response, a faint but undeniable movement that caught Emily's breath in her throat. For a fleeting moment, she could swear that Dylan was trying to reach for the cat, his small, delicate fingers stretching ever so slightly toward Whisker's reassuring presence. It was a simple moment, but it carried the weight of a miracle for Emily. Over the weeks that followed, she made it a point to bring Whisker along to Dylan's therapy sessions. What had initially been a hesitant experiment soon became a cherished routine. The cat's presence seemed to make all the difference, a constant source of calm and encouragement for her little boy. Dylan's progress was slow, painfully slow at times, but it was progress nonetheless. His toes, once still and lifeless, began to wiggle more frequently, each tiny movement a triumph. His fingers, which had been so unresponsive, gradually became more reactive, responding to touch and even clenching faintly at times. And then, one unforgettable day, he attempted to lift his arm. The motion was small and unsteady, but it was enough to send Emily's heart soaring with hope. Each step forward was celebrated like a miracle by Emily and Marcus. They documented every milestone with a mixture of awe and gratitude, taking videos and snapping pictures at every opportunity. One evening, as they sat beside Dylan, Marcus let out an excited exclamation.
Look at him go!
He said, his voice filled with a rare and unguarded joy. Now, Dylan had managed to hold his arm up for a few precious seconds before it fell back down again. Emily clapped her hands instinctively, her eyes brimming with tears that spilled freely down her cheeks. She felt no need to wipe them away. They were tears of happiness, tears of relief, and tears of a hope she had almost forgotten how to feel. For so long, despair had hung over their lives like a storm cloud, a heavy weight that pressed down on them, suffocating their ability to dream or believe in a brighter future. They had been too afraid to hope, too afraid to imagine that things could ever change. But now, with each tiny step Dylan took, they allowed themselves to hope again. They allowed themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Meanwhile, Whisker's bond with Dylan grew stronger with each passing day, an unspoken connection that seemed almost otherworldly in its depth. The cat, who had always been so independent and aloof, now took on a role that bordered on protective. If Dylan cried, Whisker would meow loudly, his voice sharp and insistent as he paced anxiously back and forth, refusing to settle until either Emily or Marcus came to check on their son. At night, Whisker's watchful presence never wavered. He would curl up at the foot of Dylan's crib, his small body a warm and comforting weight. His purring filled the quiet room like a lullaby, a soft and steady rhythm that seemed to soothe Dylan into peaceful slumber. It was as though Whisker had appointed himself as Dylan's guardian, a steadfast companion in his journey toward recovery. Through it all, Emily watched with a mixture of wonder and gratitude. Each moment, each tiny victory, and each shared connection between Dylan and Whisker reminded her that even in the darkest times, there was room for light. Slowly but surely, she began to believe in the possibility of brighter days ahead. One evening, Emily noticed Whisker standing in the hallway. The small, tabby cat was positioned firmly in front of the doorway, blocking the path of a visiting relative who had been speaking a little too loudly near Dylan's room. The relative stopped in their tracks, momentarily stunned by the cat's determined stance. Whisker didn't hiss or growl. He simply stood there, unyielding, as if to say, "This is as far as you go." Emily couldn't help but laugh softly as she walked over to scoop him up in her arms.
He's like a little guardian.
She said, her voice light but filled with genuine admiration. As she cradled Whisker, stroking the fur along his back, she couldn't help but think about how protective he had become. Not just of Dylan, but of their entire little family. It wasn't just moments like this that left Emily in awe. Whisker seemed to have an almost uncanny ability to sense when Dylan needed comfort. On days when Dylan was particularly fussy, when no amount of rocking or lullabies seemed to calm him, Whisker would quietly appear. Without any prompting, the cat would leap up onto the crib, his movements graceful and deliberate, and settle down right next to Dylan. He would curl his soft, warm body against the baby's side, pressing gently but firmly as if to let Dylan know he was there. Then he would start purring, a low, steady vibration that seemed to have a magical effect. Within minutes, Dylan's cries would subside, replaced by soft, steady breaths as he drifted into a peaceful sleep. It was as if Whisker's presence alone had the power to soothe him in a way nothing else could. Emily found herself wanting to capture these moments, to hold on to them forever. She began documenting everything. Her phone quickly filled with photos and videos of Dylan and Whisker together. She snapped pictures of the way Dylan's face lit up whenever Whisker entered the room, his little eyes sparkling with excitement. She recorded videos of the gentle nudges Whisker gave Dylan, the way the baby's tiny fingers would twitch in response, and the moments when Dylan would reach out, his small hand brushing against Whisker's fur. Each image, each video felt precious, like a piece of a story she never wanted to forget. A story of hope, resilience, and the remarkable bond between a baby and his cat. One evening, after Dylan had gone to bed, Emily sat on the couch scrolling through her phone. She paused on a video she had taken earlier that day. In it, Whisker was lying beside Dylan in the crib, his small paw resting lightly on the baby's arm. Emily smiled as she watched, her heart swelling at the sight of the two of them together. But then, something caught her eye. She rewound the video, her breath hitching as she realized what she was seeing. In the clip, Dylan's fingers twitched slightly. Then they wiggled, and finally, for just a fleeting moment, they closed around Whisker's paw. Emily stared at the screen, her eyes wide with disbelief. She replayed the video over and over, watching the moment again and again as tears filled her eyes. It was such a small movement, so brief that it might have been easy to miss. But to her, it was monumental. For months, they had waited, hoped, and prayed for progress. And now here it was, right in front of her, captured on video.
Look at this.
She said, her voice trembling. Marcus watched the video, his eyes widening.
He's holding on.
He whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Emily nodded, smiling through her tears.
I think Whisker is doing something miraculous.
Marcus wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close.
Then we've got to keep believing.
He said.
For Dylan. For all of us.
As Emily leaned her head against Marcus's shoulder, Whisker jumped onto the couch, curling up beside them. Emily reached out to stroke his fur, her heart full of gratitude. It was another routine checkup at the clinic, though Emily couldn't help but feel nervous as she pushed Dylan's stroller into the examination room. She'd been to so many of these appointments, each one blending into the next with little change, but today felt different. There was a quiet sense of anticipation in the air. Dr. Parker, Dylan's neurologist, walked in with his usual calm demeanor, but even he seemed slightly more attentive. Emily could tell something was off when he immediately turned his focus to the results on the screen. He muttered, scrolling through the chart.
This is unexpected.
Emily's heart skipped a beat.
What do you mean?
Dr. Parker glanced at her, then back at the screen.
Dylan's neural activity is showing improvement, much more than we expected at this stage, and his muscle responses, they're stronger too.
Emily could hardly believe what she was hearing. It was rare for Dylan to show any kind of progress at all. After all the months of therapy and countless treatments, every tiny bit of movement had always been slow and hard-earned.
Is this normal?
Marcus asked, his voice filled with cautious hope. Dr. Parker shook his head slowly.
Not quite. It's unusual, to say the least. We've been tracking Dylan's progress, and while we've seen some changes over time, this sudden improvement, it's unexpected.
Emily and Marcus exchanged a look. Could it be possible? Could Whisker's presence really be making a difference? But that seemed impossible, didn't it? The doctor continued, unaware of the thoughts running through their minds.
We're looking into possible explanations. One theory is that the low-frequency vibrations from a cat's purring could act as a form of natural therapy. The purring might stimulate muscles and the nervous system in a way we don't fully understand. But even then, this kind of progress is rare.
Emily's mind raced. Whisker's constant purring, the way he seemed to settle near Dylan during his naps or therapy sessions, it was hard to ignore how much of an impact he had. But this was something else. At home that evening, Emily and Marcus sat at the kitchen table, both processing the doctor's words. The idea that Whisker's purring could be the key to Dylan's recovery seemed so simple, but it felt right. It didn't explain everything, but it made sense in a way nothing else had.
I don't know what's happening,
Marcus said quietly.
but something is working. I feel like we have to trust this, whatever it is.
Emily nodded, her heart swelling with emotion.
I think it's more than just science. I think it's love. Whisker loves him, and somehow Dylan feels it.
They both sat in silence for a moment, considering how much their world had changed in the last few weeks. Dylan was making progress, real progress, and Whisker was right there with him, every step of the way. As the days passed, Emily and Marcus couldn't keep their growing belief to themselves. They started sharing the story of Whisker's role in Dylan's recovery with friends and family, and the reactions were a mixture of disbelief and amazement. People who had been skeptical at first now found it hard to deny that there was something special going on.
I've never heard of anything like this.
Emily's sister Anne said, her eyes wide as she listened.
But you know, it makes sense. Animals have an incredible way of sensing what we need.
Marcus smiled.
It's hard to explain, but I don't need to explain it. I just need to believe it.
The family began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. Each day, as they watched Dylan slowly but steadily progress, they held on to every moment. They no longer measured success by big leaps. Instead, it was the small wins. The way Dylan's fingers would move a little more, how he would try to lift his arm just a little higher. Each time Whisker was near, there was a sense of calm that surrounded them, like everything in their world was finally coming together. Emily and Marcus started to see the healing process in a new light. It wasn't just about doctors or therapies. It was about love, about the quiet, steady bond between their son and his cat. It was about the belief that sometimes the most miraculous things in life couldn't be explained by science alone. As they sat together in the living room one evening, with Dylan on Emily's lap and Whisker curled up beside them, Emily realized that whatever the future held, they were ready. They had their family, their hope, and their extraordinary cat. And that in itself was a miracle. It was a quiet morning, the sun streaming in through the window, casting a warm glow over the living room. Emily was sitting beside Dylan, watching as he lay on his stomach, his eyes wide and focused on Whisker, who was lounging nearby in his usual spot. The cat had been by Dylan's side for weeks now, and Emily had grown accustomed to seeing the two together. Dylan calm and attentive, Whisker purring gently, always close. But today was different. As Emily watched, she saw something she hadn't expected. Dylan, with his tiny outstretched arms, moved them both at once, slowly but purposefully. His hands reached toward Whisker, trembling with the effort, but there was no mistaking it. He was reaching. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stared in disbelief.
Marcus!
She gasped, unable to tear her eyes away. Marcus, who had been in the kitchen, rushed into the room. He followed Emily's gaze, his eyes widening as he saw their son's hands reaching out toward the cat. Dylan's arms wavered for a moment, but then he touched Whisker, his tiny fingers brushing against the soft fur. It was the first time he had moved both arms fully in months. In that moment, everything stopped. Emily collapsed to her knees, overwhelmed with emotion. Tears streamed down her face, and she couldn't hold back the sobs.
He did it! He did it!
She whispered, her voice breaking. Marcus was beside her in an instant, pulling her into his arms.
I know.
He whispered back, his own voice thick with emotion.
He's amazing, Emily. He's really doing it.
The celebration came quickly after. Marcus grabbed the phone and called Dr. Parker, his voice shaking as he spoke.
Dylan just moved both arms. He's reaching for things, doctor. It's happening.
The line was quiet for a moment, and then Dr. Parker's voice came through, filled with awe.
That's incredible.
He said, sounding genuinely speechless.
I need to see him. I'll make arrangements for a checkup right away. This is unexpected progress. You're witnessing something extraordinary.
Emily could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had seen the little movements, the small twitches of Dylan's fingers. But this was something else entirely. This was the beginning of a breakthrough, one she had dared to hope for, but never truly believed could come. Later that day, after the neurologist had confirmed what they had hoped, that Dylan was making significant progress, the family celebrated. Marcus brought out Dylan's favorite toy, and Emily clapped her hands with joy. Dylan smiled, his face lighting up as he looked between his parents and Whisker, who had been quietly observing the whole scene. The breakthroughs didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, Dylan's progress seemed to build upon itself, each milestone more incredible than the last. One day, almost out of nowhere, he managed to roll over, a feat that had once seemed like an insurmountable challenge. Emily and Marcus could hardly believe what they were seeing. The sight of their little boy turning himself over, his determination written all over his tiny face, brought them to tears. Then came the day he sat up for the first time, his back straight and steady, his small hands reaching out instinctively for balance. It was a moment they thought they might never witness, and when it happened, their cheers filled the room, their hearts swelling with pride and an almost disbelieving sense of joy. As the days went on, Dylan's progress continued to defy the odds. Soon he began to crawl. At first his movements were slow and unsteady, each inch forward a visible struggle. But with every attempt, he grew a little stronger, his motions a little more deliberate. Watching him inch his way across the room felt like witnessing a miracle unfold right before their eyes. What once seemed impossible was now happening, and it was as if hope itself had taken physical form in their son's efforts. Through every breakthrough, Whisker was there, a constant and loyal companion by Dylan's side. When Dylan rolled over for the first time, Whisker was lying nearby, his soothing purrs filling the room with a quiet sense of calm. When Dylan sat up on his own, Whisker stayed close, his soft fur brushing against Dylan's back, almost as if he were offering silent support. During those early crawling attempts, Whisker seemed to take on the role of motivator, nuzzling Dylan's hands or playfully batting at them, as if encouraging him to keep going. It was astonishing to Emily how Whisker seemed to know exactly what Dylan needed at every moment. Sometimes he would sit nearby, his steady presence offering quiet reassurance, a comforting anchor for Dylan as he navigated these new challenges. Other times he would actively engage with Dylan, swiping at his hands or rubbing against him as if to say, "You've got this." The bond between the two was unlike anything Emily had ever seen, a connection so pure and instinctive that it left her speechless. As the weeks turned into months, the family couldn't help but marvel at the transformation they were witnessing. Dylan was no longer just their baby. He had become a symbol of resilience and hope, a testament to the power of persistence and love. Each new milestone, no matter how small, felt like a triumph over the fear and uncertainty that had once consumed their lives. They celebrated every achievement with gratitude and joy, their once heavy hearts now buoyed by a renewed sense of belief in the future. And Whisker, who had once been a quiet and unassuming presence in their home, had become an integral part of their journey. He was no longer just the family cat. He was a companion, a motivator, and, in his own quiet way, a healer. Emily couldn't help but smile every time she saw the two of them together, the way Whisker would curl up beside Dylan or nuzzle his hand, his affection unwavering. Whisker wasn't just a pet anymore. He was a vital part of their family, a silent partner in Dylan's recovery, and, in Emily's eyes, nothing short of a miracle worker. Dylan's progress was slow but steady, and the family clung to every sign of improvement with hope and gratitude. With each new movement, each new milestone, they were reminded of just how far they had come, and through it all, Whisker remained a constant source of strength and comfort. In the quiet moments when Emily watched Dylan reach for Whisker or saw the cat stretch out beside him, purring softly, she knew one thing for certain. This bond between her son and their cat was something extraordinary, something that had brought light into their lives when they needed it most.